as far as Europe is concerned, the lasting effects were that once exposed, plague would reemerge in Europe periodically for the next several centuries, at least once a generation. That's roughly every 20 or 30 years, up through the 18th century. But it's this first contact, this first episode in the mid 14th century that was the most lethal. It's estimated that between 20 and 25 million people died in Europe alone, with an estimated 100 to 100 plus million people dying worldwide. It should be also noted that bubonic plague is still with us. That it's still a disease, a bacteria that infects human beings. But there are obviously antibodies that we have and treatment that mitigates the effects, and people die from it much less frequently. Also, that we practice much higher standards of hygiene help in that regard as well. There are key effects, key results coming out of this experience, however, in four main areas: agriculture, labor, technology, and which includes and also social mobility, social and cultural kind of mobility. With regard to agriculture, there were fewer people to feed. With a drop in population in an overpopulated continent, this meant that the price of food declined, which had been going up prior to the onset of the bubonic plague. There wasn't enough food to go around for the population prior to this disease, also which might have compromised immune systems because they had a poor diet. So as a result, agriculture is going to actually kind of rebound. The pressure is going to be taken off the farming industry to support the population. And this allowed them to turn to growing a wider variety of crops. Things like grapes, barley, dairy products, providing dairy products. These were once again became more popular rather than concentrating on bulk kind of cereal grains and goods simply to feed the hungry, feed the people. Instead, now you can have a more diversified diet as farmers begin to broaden the cultivation of crops. As far as labor is concerned, the labor pool shrank, and as a result, with fewer workers, those that survived had a greater leverage, so they could demand higher wages. There was an abundance of work to go around. If one did not have feel that they were getting a wage, a proper wage, they could travel or work elsewhere and benefit from a higher negotiated wage. Also, disease does not discriminate. That is to say that all members on the social ladder were affected equally. This created new opportunities. It allowed for social advancement. Landlords were now at the mercy of those looking to buy or rent property. There was more property available and in a state of flux as a result of the the population decline. And we're talking about a rapid population decline. There was a change in the mentality of society and culture in Europe itself, that there was a focus on getting more out of life, if not the most out of life, by doing the most with what you could with the time you had. So there was an emphasis on acquiring more comfortable standards of living, a growth in focusing on materialism and acquiring material goods, kind of a live for today type of mentality. And this was in direct contrast to more traditional social norms that were focused on depriving your mortal self of luxury, and focusing on religious piety and basically living a moral life in order to attain salvation in the afterlife. That was largely abandoned or transitioned away from during the bubonic plague and its aftermath. Work, labor begins to define meaning in people's lives, and existence rather than religious devotion. So, what do you bring to the table as far as your ability to contribute to the common survival, the greater good, essentially? Knowledge and technology also experienced transformative change during this period of time as well. In the areas of knowledge, there was an emphasis on more accurate timekeeping, perhaps out of a fundamental need to make the most of time that you had. Medicine was also benefited from new practices. Things like experimentation and pharmacology became more formalized and regimented. There was an interest in public safety and public health during this period of time to systematically trace the transmission of disease and try to mitigate and address those causes in order to mitigate the disease and its spread. Also, in the field of education, there was transformative change. It became less formalized. Prior to the plague, if one wanted to become a scholar, they often had to enter and become a member of the clergy, the church, because it was the church that really held the keys to unlocking knowledge. Most of the texts that had been preserved were texts written in Latin, a language that was not spoken by the masses. In fact, it's what's called a dead language. It's really preserved most extensively in written text in a written format. It's only the Catholic Church today that conducts any type of business or religious ceremonies in Latin. Outside of that, it really serves no function directly in wider society. Yet, nonetheless, if you wanted to become a scholar, if you wanted to become enlightened in these areas of speciality, then you had to learn this other language even before you could start to pursue a scholarly life. That all changes with the onset of the bubonic plague. There's no time to devote years of time and attention to learning Latin. So what happens is that people begin to study in their own vernacular languages like Italian, French, English, German, and works. Texts begin to be translated into these vernacular languages, so knowledge becomes more accessible to a broader segment of society. Now, you still had to be literate, which was by no means universal, but at the very least it became more accessible because people that were literate in their own vernacular language now had greater access to knowledge. And this is a key development. This access to knowledge is a key development to the onset of the Renaissance, which is something we'll address next week. There's also a more general embrace of technology and technological development to replace the skilled labor and craftsmen and craftspeople that were lost in these epidemics in the bubonic plague. It was imperative that technology be employed to make up to fill that gap. So in a hypothetical, you could have a master craftsman uh, become ill with 20 years, say, of um, professional working knowledge of his or her industry, fall ill with bubonic plague and be dead within a week. And that's 20 years of knowledge and experience that has been wiped out. Um, People entering into professional trades really did not care to apprentice for X number of years in order to become a master at a certain industry, a certain craft. There wasn't time for that. And so um, the focus on technological innovation, technological development, became more of a characteristic of the modern age. Um, Things like the crossbow, eyeglasses, um, firearms, gunpowder really began to be put into regular use or more regular use during this period of time. They became more heavily relied upon. Technology, even today, you might say, reduces the time it took to train people to do a certain task. It led to greater efficiency, which is, as you might expect, or as you might conclude, is symptomatic of modernity itself. Military technology was put into almost immediate use, largely as a result of the concurrent event that was affecting much of Europe during this period of time, or at least heavily affecting England and France during this period of time, what's known as the Hundred Years' War. The war itself was is largely bundled into three separate phases. Um, the first two phases were went in England's favor, and the third phase was decisive in France's favor. Essentially, the background very quickly to this conflict was where the royal households, the kings and their family trees between in England and also in France were very closely intertwined. This is largely as a result of William the Conqueror's successful invasion of England from Normandy in 1066. By the Hundred Years' War, by the 14th century, there is a vacancy. The reigning king of France has died. There's no apparent or direct heir, and it's at this time that the reigning king in England sees an opportunity to seize the crown of France, and therefore become not only the king of England but also simultaneously the king of France. That he, in his estimation, had a legitimate claim to the throne in France. And so this ignites the conflict between these two powers in Europe. It's also early on, throughout the course of this war that was raged periodically with periodic intensity over the course of 100 years. They used gunpowder, cannon at various battles over the course of the 100 years. Oftentimes, when the plague was running rampant in either England or France or both, hostilities would abate. They would kind of cool until the immediate emergency passed, when the bubonic plague was not running roughshod through the populations. Then these two would go back at it as far as conflicting with one another. So it's not to say that the Hundred Years' War was a constant state of war for a century, but that these phases, when they're seen as all part of a larger whole known as the Hundred Years' War. In the second phase, the culminating event occurred on October 25th, 1415, at the Battle of Agincourt. This is where English forces, some 6,000 men, most of which were lightly armed archers, and were footsore, battle weary. They had been marching for some 250 miles towards the city of Calais, a port city on the northern shore of what is today France, along the English Channel. The idea was that they would get to that port facility, they would be resupplied, reprovisioned, and be safe from any type of immediate destruction. French forces understood the predicament that the English forces were in, and they realized that they had this opportunity to decide this war once and for all if they could cut off these English forces from getting to Calais and resupplying. So French forces, numbering some 20 to 30,000 men, most of which were knights and heavy cavalry, stood between the King of England, Henry V's army, and their safe haven of Calais along the northern coast. Against overwhelming odds, the French forces end up being routed in a colossal defeat known as the Battle of Agincourt, occurring in late October of 1415. This was largely the result of English longbowmen being able to effectively mow down the French forces that were charging across this muddy morass of a field as they tried to engage the English forces. The morale of both armies may have also played a significant role here in this unlikely outcome of an English victory. The English, for their side, basically fought for their very survival here. They knew that if they lost this battle, that their lives would largely be forfeit. It also helped that they had their king, King Henry V, on the field of battle with them, so that they were not only fighting for their own survival, they were directly fighting for their sovereign, which has a particularly high motivating effect in that day and age. French nobles, on the other hand, were more interested in divvying up the spoils of war. It's recorded that on the eve of battle, these rival French nobles were sitting around talking about what loot they would lay claim to once the English had been defeated. So that there was bickering even before the battle began. There was poor coordination of attacks on the part of the French. There were personal rivalries that helped to undermine any type of broader cohesion among the French forces. Also, these are French nobles fighting. The French king was not on the field, and so power was decentralized into the hands of these nobles. So there was no unifying chain of command, essentially, that helped to organize the French forces. Also, there's a kind of a social hierarchical aspect at play here in this particular battle, one where you have these English longbowmen who are employed for pennies a day for their service, often coming from the ranks of the common class, fighting and utterly destroying the noble aristocracy of the French kingdom. So that has a particularly kind of socially significant aspect to this one-day battle. fortunes changed. The fortunes of war changed in the third stage, of the last stage of the Hundred Years' War. Henry V, who had enjoyed victory at Agincourt, now not only by 1429 had not only to face the French forces, but France was also allied with and supported by a new Scottish army that had landed in France. The Scots, in what is today the northern portion of the United Kingdom, were no friends to the English, had been subject to English brutality under the English sovereign, and so therefore the Scots decided to support the French forces against Henry V. The English also had trouble keeping peace in the portions of the French countryside that they controlled, again because there was such a close intermarriage and association between English nobility. That meant that and the French crown. This meant that English nobles often had extensive land holdings in France along the European mainland. The locals, the local French under English rule in those areas, rose up in rebellion, and so now the English nobles that were having to oversee and protect those areas now had to protect against their, these contests for power within the borders of their own estates. In 1422, to compound matters and issues for the English crown, Henry V dies. His son is nothing but an infant and unable to rule in his own right, and so there's a regent that would be put in place on the throne and would decide matters of state until such time that the actual sovereign, who would become Henry VI, would be able to take over the reins of power officially. So there was, again, kind of a king pro tem, just kind of a temporary king for this period of time for the English. At almost the exact same time, in 1422, King Charles VII of France proclaims himself king of his people, of France itself. Now, he proclaimed himself king, but the coronation to actually become the official process by which an individual becomes king could not be held until 1429. So in this 7-year interim, King Charles VII is what's known as the Dauphin. He is king in name only, essentially, until this ceremony can be held to make it official. The reason why it couldn't be officially coronated is because the traditional location for that event was in possession of the English. In 1429, the French liberate the town of, probably going to mispronounce this, Rheims, to have the ceremony of the coronation take place. The liberation of that town is largely a result of the efforts of Joan of Arc, a 16-year-old peasant girl coming from the French peasant class, who proclaimed that she had had numerous visions, divine in origin, that showed her leading the French people to victory against the English. This proclamation, this revelation, helped to revive the fighting spirit through the ranks of the French military. Joan of Arc was quite effective in her rallying and commanding of troops, In 1429, she was wounded on the field of battle at the Battle of Orleans. She was successful in defeating the English on several occasions. The siege of several cities, English held cities, and the liberation of those cities in the eyes of the French meant that her stature among the population, the French population, grew enormously. In 1430, however, Joan of Arc is captured. She was captured by what are known as French aristocracy, the Burgundians. They were essentially members of landed French nobility, essentially, and they were allied with the English at the time. They captured Joan of Arc, turned her over to the English, who promptly tried her for heresy and for her crimes of witchcraft, where she was accused of seeing visions of various saints and receiving all these prophecies. She was burned at the stake. So one person's holy warrior becomes another people's heretic. By 1437, the Burgundians, the same Burgundians that had 7 years earlier betrayed Joan of Arc, switched their allegiance from the English to the French king, who was now actually king, King Charles VII. This happened as the fortunes of war began to turn in favor of the French sovereign as well. And over the next 2 decades, English influence on the mainland of Europe began to decline. The French were able to consolidate their holdings, and this allowed Charles to recapture all English possessions on the continent. And what's significant about the 100 Years' War here is that it promoted the growth of nationalism in both England and France. The war contributed to notions of identity. Under church rule, people identified themselves primarily as Christians, and that was the case for much of English history, or much of European history, following the fall of the Roman Empire. The problem with the 100 Years' War, however, is that the two combatants, the English and the French, are both Christian people. So other characteristics were needed to distinguish one from the other. And that's where the notions of nationalism come in, that people began to identify more directly with their liege, their sovereign, their king, and their Englishness or their Frenchness, rather than their religion. Military technology also proved extremely important. The feeding of and fielding of an army became prohibitively expensive, and so in order to keep costs down, military strategists began to focus on employing cheaper manpower, that is to say, the common class, in the ranks to form the ranks, the actual physical ranks of an army. This is seen most clearly in the case of the Battle of Agincourt, where King Henry V of England is surrounded virtually by a majority of commoners that are helping to protect him, save him from being captured. Commoners were easier to train, and they fought and worked for lower pay. Again, they were earning pennies a day, as opposed to having to reward nobles with lavish expanses of land or other property or large amounts of wealth. And so in return for that, there's a certain degree of social empowerment that's beginning to take place, uh, where commoners are gaining greater leverage. And I won't say parity really this early on, but at the very least, the trend is beginning to swing in that direction, particularly in England. France is going to take almost the direct opposite approach. Uh, but for English veterans of this war, they had paid a price. They had made sacrifices. They had earned valor on the field of battle in places like Agincourt, and so therefore there was a the avenues of influence and leverage and power were opened and available, made more easily available to um, the English um, greater ranks of English society.